ChuckWagon MTG is sponsored by BC Comics and Games. Welcome and thank you for joining us for another great deck tech video here on ChuckWagon MTG. Today, we bring you Charlie's Angels. Now, Charlie's Angels isn't a tribal deck in the traditional sense, as it has some creatures that are not angels, but there are plenty of them, and they can put a real hurt on your opponents with this deck's speedy ramp into threats from above. So let's take a look at the creatures we have in this deck. We have one copy of Angel of Condemnation, a 3/3 angel for 2 generic and 2 white mana that has flying and vigilance, and it has 2 abilities. The first one is pay 2 generic and 1 white mana and tap it. You get to exile another target creature and then return it to the battlefield under its owner's control at the beginning of the next end step. And then it has another one for 2 generic and 1 white mana. Tap it and you get to exert Angel of Condemnation, exile target creature until Angel of Condemnation leaves the battlefield. We then have 3 copies of Angel of Invention, a 2/1 angel for 3 generic and 2 white mana that has flying, vigilance, and lifelink, and has Fabricate of 2. Essentially, you put 2 +1/+1 counters on it when it comes in the battlefield, or you get to create 2 1/1 servo tokens, and then other creatures you control get +1/+1. Next up, we have 3 copies of Angel of Sanctions, a 3/4 angel for 3 generic and 2 white mana that has flying, and then when it enters the battlefield, you may exile target non-land permanent and opponent controls until the angel leaves the battlefield, and then it also has the embalm cost of 5 generic and 1 white mana, so you essentially get to use this creature twice as long as they don't exile it. We continue down our list of angels with Lyra Dawnbringer, a 5/5 legendary angel for 3 generic and 2 white mana that has flying, first strike, and lifelink, and other angels you control get +1/+1 and have lifelink. Last up on our list of angels, we have 3 copies of Shalai, Voice of Plenty, a 3/4 legendary angel for 3 generic and 1 white mana that has flying, and you, planeswalkers you control, and other creatures you control have hexproof, and then it has a secondary ability of 4 generic and 2 green mana. You get to put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control. And what would angels do without a god? Well, we have 2 copies of Ronas the Indomitable to watch over those angels. He's a 5/5 legendary god for 2 generic and 1 green mana that has Death Touch and Indestructible. He cannot attack or block unless you control another creature with power 4 or greater, and he has the ability of pay 2 generic and 1 green mana. Another target creature gets +2/+0 and gains trample until end of turn. And since no greater power is complete without followers, we have 4 copies of Llanowar Elves, a 1/1 elf for 1 green mana that can tap to add 1 green mana to our mana pool. And then, to bow down next to their elvish brethren, we have 4 copies of Skymarcher Aspirant, a 2/1 vampire soldier for 1 white mana that has flying as long as you have the City's Blessing. Up next, we have 3 copies of Song of Freyalise, an enchantment saga for 1 generic and 1 green mana that for the first 2 saga counters until your next turn, creatures you control gain tap and then add 1 mana of any color to your mana pool, and then on the 3rd saga counter, you get to put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control, and those creatures gain vigilance, trample, and indestructible until end of turn. So what we have so far is the base of the deck, with the rest of it being support. So we're going to stop real quick and take a look at what we have so far and what we want to do with it. While the Sky Marchers can be handy while we have the City's Blessing, their main purpose is to help us ramp into our angels when Song of the Freyalise is out. Between the Sky Marchers and the Llanowar Elves, we should be able to cast anything in this deck by turn 4 and turn 3 with the perfect opening hand. As for our girls from above, Angel of Sanctions and Angel of Condemnation will help us control any major threats our opponents happen to get out to the battlefield, while the Angel of Invention and Lyra Dawnbringer pump our team. Then we have Shalai, Voice for the Plenty, to protect us and our board. So now let's take a look at the rest of the cards we have in this deck, which are mainly for support. We have 2 copies of Ixalan's Binding, an enchantment for 3 generic and 1 white mana. When it enters the battlefield, exile target non-land permanent an opponent controls until Ixalan's Binding leaves the battlefield, and your opponent can't cast spells with the same name as the exiled card. Next, we have 3 copies of Seal Away, an enchantment for 1 generic and 1 white mana that has flash, and when it enters the battlefield, exile target tapped creature an opponent controls until Seal Away leaves the battlefield. We're also running 1 copy of Fragmentize, a sorcery for 1 white mana that destroys target artifact or enchantment with converted mana cost of 4 or less. Next, we have 2 copies of Settle the Wreckage, an instant spell for 2 generic and 2 white mana. Exile all attacking creatures target player controls. That player may search his or her library for that many basic land cards, put them onto the battlefield tapped, and then shuffle their library. We also have 3 copies of Gideon of the Trials, a planeswalker for 1 generic and 2 white mana that comes into the battlefield with 3 loyalty counters on him. He has a +1 ability of, until next turn, prevent all damage target permanent would deal. He has a -0 ability that makes him a 4/4 human soldier creature with indestructible that's still a planeswalker, and then you prevent all damage that would be dealt to him this turn. He then has a second 0 ability of, you get an emblem with, as long as you control a Gideon's planeswalker, you can't lose the game and your opponents can't win the game. Now, while turning him into a 4/4 human beat stick is nice, his main goal in this deck is to use his +1 ability of preventing damage from something to kind of slow down the early game, and to draw fire. You see, he's not really imperative to winning in this deck, and a lot of people look at Gideon and see him as a threat, so he's going to draw a little bit of pressure and give us time to set up our battlefield. And lastly, we have 1 copy of Prophetic Prism, an artifact for 2 generic mana, and when it enters the battlefield, you draw a card. You can then pay 1 generic mana, tap it, and then add 1 mana of any color to your mana pool. Essentially, this is just a little bit of mana fixing with the benefit of an extra card draw. Our land base consists of 2 copies of Field of Ruin that taps for a colorless mana, or we can pay 2 generic, tap it and sacrifice it, destroy target non-basic land an opponent controls, and then each player searches their library for a basic land card, puts it onto the battlefield, and then shuffles their library. This is for any of those pesky flip lands that we happen to run into. We also have 2 copies of Scavenger Grounds that taps for a colorless mana, or we can pay 2 generic, tap it and sacrifice it, and exile all cards from all graveyards. This is for any Scarab God decks we happen to run into, or anything else that happens to dig into the graveyard. We also have 4 copies of Sunpetal Grove that can tap for either a green or a white mana, and it enters the battlefield tapped unless we control a forest or a plains. We then have 5 forests and 10 plains to round out the land base in this deck. For our sideboard, we have 2 copies of Authority of the Consuls, an enchantment for 1 white mana. Creatures your opponent's control enter the battlefield tapped, and whenever a creature enters the battlefield under an opponent's control, you gain 1 life. This is going to slow down any type of aggro decks we happen to go up against. We also have 2 copies of Exquisite Archangel, a 5/5 angel for 5 generic and 2 white mana. It has flying, and if you would lose the game, instead exile Exquisite Archangel, and your life total becomes equal to your starting life total. This is again for any deck that happens to outpace us. Next, we have 2 copies of Forsake the Worldly, an instant for 2 generic and 1 white mana. Exile target artifact or enchantment. It also has cycling of 2. We then have 3 more copies of Fragmentize. Now these are essentially for any enchantment heavy decks or any artifact heavy decks, especially the red aggro that happens to be so popular right now. Up next, we have 4 copies of Heroic Intervention, an instant for 1 generic and 1 green mana. Permanents you control gain hexproof and indestructible until end of turn. This is for any removal heavy decks or any deck that happens to run Goblin Chain Whirler. We have one copy of Solemnity, an enchantment for 2 generic and 1 white mana. Players can't get counters, and counters can't be put on artifacts, creatures, enchantments, or lands. This is just in case we happen to see any counter decks out there. And lastly, we have one copy of Urza's Ruinous Blast, a legendary sorcery for 4 generic and 1 white mana. Exile all non-land permanents that aren't legendary. This makes sense just because we have just enough legendary angels and permanents to make this worthwhile as kind of a last-ditch effort should we need it. Well, that about wraps up our deck tech for Charlie's Angels. This deck is insanely fun and surprisingly fast considering what our mana curve looks like. Now, if you happen to play this deck at your F&M or just at your kitchen table, we'd love to hear about it down in the comments. And if you didn't play this deck, but you still have some thoughts, we'd love to hear those too. I want to thank you very much for watching today. If you liked what you saw, do us a huge favor, click that like button, hit subscribe, be sure to hit the little bell notification button so you can tell when we come out with new episodes, and be sure to share this with your friends, your family, your loved ones, and your pets. Everyone could use a little more magic in their lives. Once again, thank you very much for watching, and as always, you can find us on Facebook and Twitter and Twitch, ChuckWagon MTG. Now, if you could do us one last huge favor and check out this brief message from our sponsor. ChuckWagon MTG is sponsored by BC Comics and Games, now at one mega location to fill all of your gaming and comic needs. They have Magic the Gathering events every night of the week, as well as Warhammer, Pathfinder, Dungeons & Dragons Adventurers League, Final Fantasy TCG, Pokemon, and Star Wars X-Wing events all throughout the week. They also have close to 100,000 comics on site. This is why I have personally made BC Comics and Games my home gaming store.